Good morning, all. My name is Troy Robichaud, and I coordinate events and engagement at the EBI, not to be confused with the EBC with regards to acronyms. Very happy to have Hans-Peter Schmidt of Ithaka Institute, as well as Ueli Steiner of Carbon Standards International here today to do a deep dive with regards to the new and exciting C-Sync methodology. Very exciting for the biochar industry to have another methodology coming on. And yeah, without further ado, maybe I'll go over just some quick housekeeping items. I know all participants are muted and don't have access to cameras right now. That's only for the presentation portion of today's webinar. I will allow access later with regards to questions, because I know there's probably a lot of detailed questions that folks have. This session is being recorded and is a public event, so we will be sharing it openly afterwards on our YouTube, and we'll be sharing links through our newsletter for members as well openly on LinkedIn. So without further ado, Hans-Peter.
Thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you today. And we worked for so long on these standards, and we got a lot of feedbacks, and included feedbacks from AB and from the expert groups. And so now, since yesterday, the standard is public, and we are happy to go through some of the new things. And so maybe why I talk here is the Ithaka Institute, who founded the EBC and developed the first C-Sync standard under the EBC, is still working for Carbon Standards International for the development of the standards. So we mainly developed it, and that's why I talk to you today. So just to start a bit on a lighter note, there is a very interesting sanctuary that is more than 4,000 years old, or dated back, in Eastern Germany, in the Magdeburger Börde. And they found, when they started with spraying pesticides by airplane on these crops, they found different coloring of the crops, and with more intense greening in those rings. And then they investigated, the archaeologists, and you guess what they find, that is the biochar. And which is very interesting is that they reconstructed, you can visit it today, this type of wooden structures. And so it was kind of sanctuary, so not housing. But as you can imagine, in this wet mid-German soil, these wooden structures, they would rot away very quickly. So apparently, they used biochar either to surround the wooden beams, or they kind of pre-pyrolyzed from the outside the beams, and that left this kind of concentrated biochar hotspots. And you can see that this biochar can be dated back for 4,500 years. Meaning that there is pretty high persistence probably linked to this material. So if we say we start like 2,500 BC, it took a while until 2012 that the first EBC European Biochar Certification standard was published and put in force. And already at this time certified and controlled by BioInspector, which is the company that is linked to Carbon Standards International. That's the same mother company. So we work together since 2012, and in 2020 it was published the first EBC C-Sync standard. It was very early version, but in fact, I would say the main elements were already there. Preparing now 4 years later, version 3 under the new name Global Biochar C-Sync. And another preliminary note: if we know that we need carbon sinks in the range of at least 800 gigatons, this is a lot. And if 30% of this would be biochar based, maybe it's less, but still it's massive. And if you can see that we find these biochar hotspots even 4,000 years later still in place, that would also mean that we massively modify our agricultural soils if we scale up biochar as we think. So therefore, the condition for the global biochar C-Sync is the quality guarantee of the biochar, and the condition for the entire global biochar C-Sync standard is that the biochar is certified either under the EBC or under the WBC, which is the new standard for worldwide carbon certification outside of the EU. So I would like now to go through the main updates of the standards, the main new parameters and elements, and then I go a bit more in detail into certain of them. We try to keep the standard short enough, or it's about 60 pages. And I'm sorry, but I think you should read through it. There are a lot of small details. We try to make it readable and interesting. So I hope it's not too dry to read through it. But within 1 hour now, I can only show some main elements, but there's a lot also in the explanations that is probably good to see with your own eyes. So let's go through these main new parameters. So the C-Sync now, and that's a difference to the earlier standard, is registered with its sequestered carbon and persistence curve. So before we calculated the carbon sink potential and deduced all the emissions that were caused for the production of the biochar from this C-Sync potential. Now this is different. We want to have the carbon that's actually in the sink registered as such. So if you go to the sink and you analyze and control it, you will find exactly the amount of carbon that's registered. So the emissions are now registered in an emission portfolio. So that is like separate. So you have an emission portfolio and you have your C-Sync. And the emission portfolio has to be, or the emissions in the emission portfolio have to be offset in order to have the carbon sink registered and usable in the register. So the producer, the processor of the biochar who makes biochar products, the trader and the user, they must offset their emissions, and then the carbon sink is free to be used as a carbon sink. However, the methane emissions, they do not need to be offset with geological C-Sinks, but can be offset with temporary C-Sinks. We will see this in a minute, how this works. We have also changed the way we accord persistence to the biochar. So there is what we earlier had the 74% over 100 years, which was based on the literature that was available in 2020. A lot happens since then. I will talk in the end about how we see and persistence and how it is based. But now this is mainly based on the H to C ratio, and we have persistent and the semi-persistent fraction at 75% persistence and 25 semi-persistence. You will see how this works. So this is PAC is persistence aromatic carbon and SPC semi-persistent carbon. And soil applied biochar is now defined and considered as a geological carbon sink. So once biochar is applied to soil, that is the moment when it enters the realm of geology. And that means it is not reversible, which is the main difference to other sinks. And so, which is also very important about the location and the definition that it goes into geology, which means it's also outside of private property laws. So you apply it to a soil, but in fact it will develop into this geological sea sink when moving down into the soil for thousands of years, and that's why the owner of the land only grants access to geology and is not, in fact, the owner of the eternal carbon sink. That's very important move in the definitions. Material carbon sinks that are not applied to soil, so they cannot claim this entry point to geology, at least not yet, because it could be that they are in a material that will eventually be applied to soil. But as long as this is not guaranteed and happened, material carbon sinks are considered temporary. So like asphalt building composite materials, we will talk about it, and this is critical, I think, also for the industry. And we will talk about these definitions, and as everything in these standards, this is valid until the next update. And if we found better solutions that are scientifically based or results of scientific investigations, changes or rules with the lawmakers, then we are ready to modify also the standards that should always up to date to the best possible knowledge we have. So temporary carbon sinks are defined and registered by their residence time, which means the time that they are sequestered. And the residence time is recorded in the matrix positive list. So they are usually be found in the carbon sink register with their carbon sink 100, which would be how much of the carbon is sequestered for 100 years, and with a curve, if some of the carbon will decay, for example, then it will be a decreasing curve. And you have in the C-Sink 100 the average of every single year of these 100 years. Same for C-Sink 50 or C-Sink 20, which would be the 20-year average of the carbon sink. And the carbon sinks, they cannot be used to offset CO2 emissions, like the geological carbon sink, the persistent fraction, but they can compensate the global warming effects for the time of their monitored sequestration. So if a temporary carbon sink is guaranteed for 100 years, a C-sink 100, then it can compensate the global warming effect of CO2 emission or other emissions for those 100 years. It has to be renewed after. So as you already heard, the C-sink must be registered in a public registry, which is the reason that last year, the Global Carbon Sink Register Foundation was founded. So it is a non-profit foundation under the Swiss laws that holds the Global C-Sink Register, where all registered of the carbon standard international standards can be found. So this is not only biochar carbon sinks, but also the global tree C-sink, the artisan C-sinks, enhanced weathering, material C-sinks, and so on. They are all in the register, and also other standards that are not Carbon Standard International may have access to it. So this is not proprietary to carbon standards. New is also, I mean, it's not really new because we already had it in the earlier standards that a tracking of the carbon sink is necessary, but it was not controlled in the standard. It was like an condition for carbon sink traders, but now this is part of the standard that every carbon unit can be followed and must be followed from its extraction from the atmosphere. That means when a tree or a crop takes up the CO2 from the atmosphere, that is the moment we start the tracking of the carbon, and it has to be tracked to the final storage or entry point to geology. So the GPS location of the entry point or of the material has to be registered. And this is not done by carbon standards, it's controlled. So there is a DMRV system in place that can be guaranteed by the producer or by a carbon sink trader, or by other entities that do the service for the producers. So that means the carbon storage is verifiable. As I said in the beginning, the carbon sink location is known, and in case you would dig into it, you could find exactly the amount of carbon that is registered and is still there, including the margins of security that we account for. And which is also new, that the energy and carbon efficiency of the production is assessed. So this is a pathway to improve the efficiencies of the industry for the next 10 years. So let me delve now a bit more into detail of those parameters. For the next some 20-25 minutes, and then we go into the discussion. I think a lot of points that are interesting to discuss and to see what reflections are behind it, why we came up with those ideas. So let's start with the emission portfolio. So the emission portfolio includes emissions from biomass production, processing and transportation, the storage of the biomass in case there are methane emissions due to decay of the biomass, but normally this should be avoided, and in most cases it is avoided. So that means if it's storage of more than 30 days in the wet conditions, which can in most cases be avoided. Then we have the emissions from the pyrolysis process and other equipment of the production sites, and this includes methane emissions of the pyrolysis process. So in every combustion you have some residual methane emissions, even if it's clean and proper and well made. They are in the best case very low, but we account for them also to avoid that there are, let's say, not fit for purpose combustion technologies. So this is controlled, and interestingly, the EBC is EBC WBC is the only standard that controls methane emissions. All other standards, I mean, not only for biochar but for combustion, they try to contour it because it's complicated and they don't know how to account for it, and it's easier to not to do it. But I mean, if we are really talking about carbon sink economy, we have to account for everything. And so in the last 3 to 4 years, it was sometimes difficult to measure the methane emissions, but now this is pretty much standard. Even for the artisan biochar products, methane emissions are measured and accounted for. And I hope this will also be standard for other carbon sink standards soon. Interestingly, the ISO norm that is always prone to be used, and because ISO is always better than own standards, but the ISO does not include methane emissions. So it may sound fancy, but it does not include all that we include here. We have also emissions from post-production and transportation. Has to be accounted for in the DMRV of the tracking system. And then there is a safety margin that is now not a percentage of the overall emissions, but is an amount per ton of biochar produced. And as the industry will evolve, we will also adapt safety margin like every 2 years at least. Now, the emission portfolio has then to be offset, which means all CO2 and N2O emissions have to be offset with geological carbon sinks. So that would be in most cases using the PAC fraction of the biochar. And that has to be done in the global C-Sink registry. And however, the methane emissions can be compensated with temporary C-Sinks. I will show you how this works. So for offsetting the CO2 off emissions, here you have a slide from the carbon sink register. So the green curve is the persistence curve of the biochar C-Sink. You have 75% is the PAC fraction, so that is geological carbon sink. And from this PAC fraction, which is below the lila dotted line, you can use this also to offset your own emissions, or you could also have just like one carbon sink for your company that you always use to offset your emissions. So you can have other carbon sinks clean to be sold to carbon sink traders. However, all your emission portfolio has to be offset. And this is controlled like once a year. So this is not like for every carbon sink batch that you register that you have to retire it directly from the carbon sink, but it's controlled that your company emissions are offset, or the traders company emissions. And so this should be pretty easy and simple. And because it's annual, it is also quite safe to be up to date for all batches. Now for the methane compensation. So as you know, most of the methane is degraded in the atmosphere or decayed in the atmosphere in the first 10-12 years. So there is a climate effect that is over the 100 years, because part of the methane or the methane is decomposed to water and CO2, and the water vapor has also climate effect. So there is a small climate effect over 100 years. So we calculate the global warming potential, the total global warming potential, or the absolute global warming potential over the 100 years of the CH4 emission. And then we use the semi-persistent carbon fraction of the biochar over at maximum 20 years. So this is 20 years of global cooling effect of the biochar C-sink, which is the yellow rectangle that you find. So if you can see my cursor, this is the SPC decay function over 1,000 years, which arrives at 100 years about here. And part of this SPC fraction is now used to compensate the global warming effect of the methane emissions of the pyrolysis and storage. So this is in fact pretty simple. The calculation is a bit more complicated, but therefore we created the SPC methane calculator that you will find online at the Carbon Standard website. And there you can calculate the methane emissions that you can compensate with your SPC. It can also, you can compensate your own methane emissions, but also sell your SPC fraction for other methane compensations. And you can see this in the register where you have your carbon sink function, but you can also use this calculator. The calculator is also equipped to calculate the trees that has to be planted, for example, and controlled for 20 years. So other material carbon sinks, let's say straw insulation of a house that's guaranteed to be there for 20 years, can also be used to compensate the methane emissions global warming effect. So we have the approved biochar uses for the C-sinks. So as we earlier mentioned, soil application is for the carbon sink today the most important application, because that guarantees the entry to geology. However, industrial uses of biochar become more and more important and are likely to surpass agricultural uses. So we describe those different considerations for the different application to animal farming, construction, and composite materials, but also like temporary biochar storage. If, for example, the biochar is not sold because you think they will be more lucrative to sell later, or because you have no clients. So then if you store the biochar for more than 1 year, it can be registered as temporary sink for this time. Some words about material carbon sinks. So if you add biochar in as functional material or as filler material in composites, plastics, concrete, whatever, so we assume that the carbon, the entire carbon persists. So there will be no biological decomposition, even of the SPC fraction. So that means for as long as this material persists, 100% of the carbon is considered as C-sink. In case for concrete, this would be considered for 100 years. So that would be 100% of the carbon is considered as C-sink for 100 years. So if this is a composite material, as you know, we build skis and snowboards. So then you would, for such small materials, you would consider an average lifetime. And then you do not control if the snowboard is still in your garage or is not in existence anymore, but there's an average lifetime of the materials that will be considered. Those informations can be found in this matrix positive list. Here you have biological matrices, which essentially is materials that are guaranteed to go to soil. And then you have mineral matrices like concrete, cement, mortar, clay plasters, asphalt, and so on. So you have here the part of carbon that is considered to be sequestered and retained. And then always you find here more information or considerations. So this is too complex to solve entirely within the standards. So we describe the conditions, how this is assessed, and if there are new materials or new projects, they have to be submitted and will then be accounted for in this way with whatever persistence curve then occurs to be fit for this purpose. Another thing that we introduced is the diffuse carbon sinks. So you have seen that traceability has to be guaranteed for the carbon sinks. So it's necessary that if a controller or outside journalist or whatever go, they will find all the information in the carbon sink register to go and check for the carbon. However, that is not practical for small units. So units that contain less than 1 ton of CO2 equivalent of biochar. So we use here the CO2 equivalent because that becomes the general unit for carbon sinks, and then it's also comparable, for example, carbon sink units for trees and other materials. So we use this 1 ton of CO2 equivalent of biochar, which is roughly, let's say, it's more than a cubic meter. And if you have packaging units that contain less, so for example, you have a 30-liter bag of potting substrate, then this would be the end of the tracing, where you package the small packages, and then this is a diffuse C-sink, and you do not need to trace it to the balcony of every buyer, but you trace it to the processor that packages into smaller packaging units. However, these packages have to be labeled as C-sink product, because if you sell a biochar containing potting substrate and the grower, the balcony grower thinks he can compensate his own driving from the garden market home with this bag, then he has to be informed that in fact the carbon sink is already registered and used for other offsetting and compensating. So that's why it has to be labeled as a C-sink product. It's how this has to be done is described in the standard. So some more smaller details. An interesting thing is that we want ceasing producers also to reduce their fossil carbon emissions. It's not that because we are in green technology and we produce carbon sinks that we do not need to look so precisely onto our own emissions. We all know we have to reduce emissions to practically zero fossil emissions, and that's why we want biochar producers to produce less than 20 kilogram of CO2 equivalent per ton of biochar in the next 10 years. And so it's the biochar greenhouse gas balance, so how much greenhouse gas per ton of biochar is produced, is assessed now, and we want to ask you to submit a plan how to reduce it to 100 kilogram per ton in 2030 and in 2035. How this is calculated is in the standard, but there's also a calculator to be found soon on the website. And Carbon Standards has also examples and help you to prepare the plan to reduce emissions. And here we introduced the pro rata approach, which is a bit strange in a way. So if a company produces electricity and heat and pyrolysis oil, for example, and biochar, then in the former standard, all emissions of the entire facility had to be compensated with the biochar ceasing. And which is not really just in a certain way because, well, the electricity is another product and has its own footprint. And it would be nice if the entire facility is climate neutral. And we hope to get there in the next 10 years. But today we have also companies that produce only like 2% of the energy content in biochar, and the rest is energy. And then it would not be just to have this sub-product carrying all the burden. And that's why there is the pro rata approach. So only the emissions that are caused for the biochar product and not for the energy products or for the oil products are accounted for to be offset, compensated, and calculated in the energy balance. Here also you find a calculator. And just to mention, Carbon Standards is highly working to create an environment with IT environment with tools and formulas that makes life easier to use. So even if the standard is more complex, certification and preparation of certification should be easier than before. So this is the task. And Ueli will talk about this in a minute, but it will take a little time to make it perfect. But the objective is to make it easier and to make it lean, and using IT to make life and calculations easier for you and also understandable. And this also is valid for the energy efficiency, which will also have a calculator. So in the earlier standards, we asked for heat use and energy use, so that there's not heat or energy wasted when you produce biochar, so that this is a more complex unit. So now we change the system and say that 60% of the energy contained in the biomass must be used So that could be used for biochar production, for electricity, for drying of the biomass, for district heating, or for chemical products that you produce. But we should not have pyrolysis units that only produce biochar and waste the remaining energy. So we have now a concrete value of 60% of the energy contained in the biomass. And the last point here is the ceasing efficiency of the pyrolysis system. So this is interesting, is like the biochar carbon, pyrolysis oil carbon, and in future when you do CSS with the CO2 from the exhaust. So this carbon, let me call this sequestrable pyrogenic carbon, should be in a relation to the carbon from the biomass. And we want to have a high ceasing efficiency, because the most important job is done by the biomass to capture the carbon from the atmosphere. So that goes back from this sequestered biomass state to the atmosphere is kind of climate wasted carbon. Even if that can be considered neutral, it is a waste of resources. So we want a high carbon efficiency. In the ideal state, all carbon from the biomass would be captured and kept here in a sequestrable way in the carbon cycling economy. So this is not a threshold value, not a limit value. It is an information for you and for carbon standards on where the biochar industry is currently regarding carbon sink efficiency. Let me have 5 more minutes to talk about our persistence considerations. As we all know, AB is very active in pushing the political agenda in the EU to consider biochar as a long-term carbon sink, and that includes persistence calculation or considerations, which is still a tricky point. So I want to show you where we stay today with the standard and where we plan to go together with the AB and other partners. So I think we reached today the status, and it's defined in the standard that the climate service from the PAC fraction of the biochar can be considered of equal permanence as geological storage. That means DAX, BEX, enhanced weathering is in the same league as PAC biochar. And I think we can consider this now as state of the industry. And the remaining biochar carbon is considered semi-persistent, which we define as the part of the biochar that's likely to decay over 1,000 years. Now, the question is, how much of the biochar carbon is PAC and how much is SPC? And just shortly mentioned, so this biochar consists of a lot of different carbon types. So short-chained aliphatic carbon, and then chains of aromatic carbons, like 2 chains, and clusters of more than 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10. And the more aromatic rings you have in a cluster, the more persistent the carbon is. And there's evidence that up to 5, 6 rings, biological degradation can happen at a low speed, but still this is measurable. But aromatic carbon with aromatic rings that exceeds 6 clusters of 6-7 rings, they are very, very hardly degradable, and that can be considered as persistent in a geological way, even considering that over 1,000 years and then for 10,000 and up to million years, this biochar will be protected by kilometers of soil and sediments, and can be considered though as persistent. So the question is, can we measure how much or how big are the clusters of aromatics ring in the biochar? There is analytical pyrolysis as a method that is not very expensive, something like 150 euros, and could be done for every biochar sample in the future, where you treat your sample under 150 bar, so high pressure, and in a hydrogen atmosphere. So you force the biochar to react at 550 degrees with hydrogen, and all that remains is are aromatic clusters of more than 7 rings, and this can be considered as persistent. So that's also our definition of PAC, that are condensed aromatic clusters of more than 7 rings, and that can be analyzed. Currently, we try to find correlation with the random reflectance method that is investigated by colleagues from Denmark, and especially in collaboration with EBC. We also find H2C and electric conductivity as very useful proxies. So I think we are pretty close to introduce persistence classes. So today this is very rough, as we say, all that is H2C below 0.4 guarantees that at least 75% of the biochar is PAC. However, we can really see that at H2C ratios below 0.2, so that is biochar, let's say, pyrolyzed at more than 650 degrees, we find 90%, guaranteed 90% of aromatic carbon. So we hope to introduce within 1 year new persistence classes, and based on analytics, and so that would be higher than 75% that we currently account for. And so we hope, or we think, that probably there will be 4 persistence classes, but this is still pending, depending on some analysis. But I think it's pretty much confirmed that somewhere in these ranges this should and will be. And so I'm through with my hour. Thank you very much for your attention. And let's biochar keep the lead in the way to the ceasing economy. Thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Hans-Peter. Very, very good overview. For the questions, I know everyone is muted right now, just because we do have a fairly large group of people and participants here. I'll ask, if you do have a question, to please raise your hand, and then I can unmute you, and then you can ask your question directly to Hans-Peter. So again, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. Okay, we have one here. Soji, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Hans-Peter. I think it's exciting to hear from you directly. Read so much and about you, and now hearing also very good. Thank you for the amazing work that you are doing. My name is Soji. I am the CEO of SMART, one of the companies helping farmers in Nigeria. Working with Carbon Standard International and seeing some of the explanation you have given, I was to ask you if, as part of the standard being updated, will it be useful to share use cases like using numbers? Some of the formulas that you've shared, very rightly shared, for us, one of the things we try to see is, can we have examples? For example, this is a number, and like paint a complete use case. Then with that, it's easier for us to be able to conceptualize what is being described. For example, will that be something to expect, or is it too much of a ask, for example? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your kind words. And I think this is a very valuable proposition, and I would maybe pass it to Ueli, who probably would also like to add some words. He's the CEO of Carbon Standards. I think this is a very good idea to create like example companies and to showcase how this works, to make it easier to understand and to onboard new companies. Yes. Maybe Ueli, you would like to add something here and also in general, if you want.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Thanks, Hans-Peter, for passing to me. Let me probably share my screen for 3 points that I would like to introduce additionally to you. The first point is exactly based already on these questions. We developed a biochar tool for managing the different data together with the Global Seasync Registry and in correlation to as good as it is possible support producers, traders in managing the production process, and also that's what follows after the biochar is produced. And I think it's a really good idea to create some example companies that you can then have access to, and you can see how it works, how the things are calculated in the background. And we will work on that. Thanks for this important input. What I would like to add is a question that that was raised many times during the review, during the public review that you had and the review in the expert group, how the transition period will be for the new standard. What are the requirements for existing EBC producers using EBC Seasync, the standard, and we will share then all the details. They are already on the website. You can find in the description of the standard, and also in the newsletter, you can find links for that, how the transition period will be for companies already producing EBC Seasyncs, registering them, that it's clear how it works. And in general, we can say that if you go back to my slide, that for already certified companies under EBC Seasync, a voluntary transition period until 1st of March 2025 is applicable. The companies needs time for preparing possibly the next batch, register the next production batch and everything. But however, the standard can also be applied earlier for newly registered production batch if it's desired and if it's seen as an advantage from the producer side. Different information you can find on our website. Also in the newsletter section. If you jump into the German or English newsletter, you find different links where you can directly reach the important information of global biochar ceasing. And of course, we are so happy to get your feedbacks and questions, not only today in this webinar, also afterwards. And feel free to contact me at any time if you have questions or additional topics. We will clarify everything and see what we can address and what we can do for have a perfect support from our end. Thanks for the question, and I think this was a little bit longer answer to the question that you had. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Ueli. I think that gave a good overview too of where folks can get some more information. That's really great. Next question in the queue we have from Peter Lindholst. I'll unmute you here. There, you can unmute yourself. There you go.
Let me give it a go. Thank you very much. And Hans-Peter, thank you very much for a nice introduction. My name is Peter Lindholst, and I work with a company called Steiner SkyClean. Clearly, a lot of thinking has been done to improve the standard. And I guess most of it is fantastic. However, the market to us appears fully unaware of fractions like SPC, PAC, and in particular, how what's the difference between, or what will be the difference between the market value of these different fractions? Now, at some point, there will be a lot of sort of education of the market going into this or being required. But to us, that is a major concern that we might confuse the market, and that is that's very dangerous, in particular in a phase where we want to build up something and scale up something. So that's more a comment rather than a question. I realize that. And also, if you look at the standard, which has been, I guess you mentioned yourself, significantly more complex and needing additional tools in order to do different kinds of calculations, then additional requirements have been introduced, like energy efficiency, and that might be, from a sort of a theoretical point of view and a client point of view, a good thing. But to us, it would be much more clever to let the market ensure efficient operations of your plants. Which basically means that if you don't use your energy for any good purpose, then you end up producing too expensive char, which you cannot sell. So the market will replace the need of these things. Theoretically, again, they might be absolutely fine. But there are more efficient ways of doing it. And I guess you mentioned on your first or second slide that moving into the gigaton range, we need the market to drive this, not snowball production. Finally, comment on the global cooling potential concept, which again, from a theoretical point of view, might make a lot of sense. I'm not sure I fully understand it yet. But educating the full industry and the markets to a global cooling potential, and risking sort of some of this entering the EU legislation, we see that as a very big risk. So it's an ambitious document, but the rate of change is such that we fear that we might end up having the opposite of what the intended purpose of the update is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Always nice to hear you. And yes, I mean, sure there is risk. In a certain way, you know, when we introduced the EBC in 2012, biochar didn't exist on a political way, and it was introduced, and so the risk was seen as applying biochar. It was not allowed, And thanks to the EBC, this changed. Now you have the EU rules, and everything is aligned for this. And in 2020, C-Sync, that was not even a product. Nobody earned €1 with C-Sync. Now this is a thriving economy, and I would say this is thanks to the EBC C-Sync, at least part of it. Now we go the next step, and as you said, there's a lot of reflection that went into it, and there are not a lot of new things, but there are a lot of new products that come out of this new carbon standard and the registry. And these are new products, and they are additional products. So I don't see that it is a risk in the way that you lose anything, because the PAC fraction, this is now called the geological carbon sink. It's much better than what we had before. Before we had C-Sync 100. Now other standards, they sell C-Sync 100 today as eternal carbon sink. I mean, 100 years is nothing for eternity. We have C-Sync, but we call it C-Sync 100 when it's 100, and that is a product. And we have geological carbon sinks, which is the most performant carbon sink product on the entire market, including DAX. So this is new. And it will be increased now from 75% to 90-95% for certain biochars, increasing the market for geological carbon sinks, the only geological carbon sinks on the market today. So that if that is the case, there is 10%, let's say, that remains as temporary carbon sink. And now you will find the global cooling concept. This is risky because nobody really understands. It's not so difficult to understand, but this is a completely new product. Imagine wooden products, wooden houses. They're not considered a carbon sink because it's temporary. So what do you do with this? So the entire concept of temporary carbon sinks does not really come from biochar, but it comes from biomaterials. And biomaterials are super key for the new fossil carbon-free economy. So we need to use the biogenic carbon more intelligently, smarter. And temporary carbon sinks will help to improve the value of biological carbon products. And we prepared the register to include this. So this is a new product, it's a new step forward, and I think when in 5 years we will talk again, it will be shown that that was a decisive step forward for the carbon sink economy to introduce an accounting system for temporary carbon sinks. You see already today there's a new product. You can do methane compensation with temporary carbon sinks. So before you needed geological carbon sinks to compensate for a global warming potential, that's only there for 20 years. Now you can account it year by year, and you have a new product. So I think if we communicate it in the right way, and I agree with you that communication is important, we have a lot of new products, and we have a super story, and it's understandable. And what we did not have in 2020, as we have today, is the EBI, which is now the communication force in the EU and also in the industry. And that is something we didn't have before. So now it's so much easier to communicate on a high level, having the professionals working on your side. So we try to make smart, intelligent, science-proofed standards. And we prepare the material that you can communicate it.
Allow me short, before I get muted again, a short comment, and I hope you are right, but I'm not sure, by far not. One short comment now. We have introduced biochar as geological storage, which is completely against the terminology used in the CRCF legislation, where geological storage is defined as storing liquid CO2 in geological foundations, which means way under the surface, whereas we have introduced the option of having biochar stored in terrestrial reservoirs exactly to allow this. And again, what we're afraid of is risking to confuse matters. Also with this, it might end up in geology. I'm not a geologist, so I can't speak to that in detail. But for sure, we have spent quite some time in explaining the need of terrestrial storage of biochar as opposed to permanent storage of CO2 in geological foundations. So we need to take care. Yeah, I think I'll leave it to others to have the word as well. Thanks.
Yeah, can I use my powers of being part of this organization to just unmute myself and step in? Because I was going to kind of add to Peter's question or remark. So thanks, Hans-Peter, for all this valuable work, and I do understand it and read through it a lot. So I get the logic. But I think Peter does have a point in making things complicated. And like just one suggestion, because we are discussing, and one suggestion of mine is to quantify what we call in this communication inertinite biochar, the inert fraction, which is measured by advanced analysis, and only quantify that. Now we have a remaining fraction, which is the semi-permanent or more labile fraction. Now, that's the question, what do you do with it? You have methane emissions, you have different types of emissions, and in general, you could overcompensate those emissions by the more labile fraction. If you do the calculations before, would that not be just a possibility? And then you would not have to do this complicated methane emissions calculator. And because this is, people do not make that much money that they would have so much time to invest in realizing their credits. Why not, just an impulse, why not make it as simple as possible, but still with a sound scientific foundation and everything that's left? I don't know if it needs to be quantified, but maybe it can be, if something in the end is left, why not give that to a service as a benefit to the environment? So just the message, why not simplify things?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a persistence curve, and you can just, if you want, you register only the geological part, and that's what you use, and you say the remaining is for my legacy emissions, and I don't quantify it. I don't want anyone to talk about it. For me, I only register the geological part of it, and if it becomes 90% or 95%, then this is just fine. However, if you have, I mean, this is also for a more general system that's not only for biochar carbon sinks. As I said, this is a system that works for material sinks, and you need to show temporary carbon sinks and create products for it. But if for the biochar world, it's easier. In fact, only to use the PAC fraction. Everything's ready to do it just like this.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's not your choice to say, oh, I'm just using the inert fraction, because you already put everything into the methodology, all the accounting for the emissions and for the emissions if your biomass sits in your storage for 2 months, and everything has to be accounted for. And of course, then you need to use those remaining short-lived removals to compensate for that. And that makes the entire equation really large.
No, this is not true, because the SPC fraction can be used for methane emissions. It cannot be used for any other emissions than methane. And if you want to compensate methane emissions with geological seasonings, you're free to do. You know, this is only a possibility that you have to make it lean. And this is really not complicated. Is you have an emission portfolio on the one side, and that has to be offset. That's the entire condition. We just showed possibilities how to offset it. We don't ask you to do it this way or that way. It's only controlled. It has to be offset. That's all. So I think it's simple. I think this is pretty simple. And just Peter, I forgot to reply to one of your questions. It's the market that decides. Sure. I mean, 60% energy efficiency. That means you have. It's an easy. You have other uses, and that's for advanced pyrolysis units. It's an easy target. It's very easy. But this is a worldwide standard, and you will be astonished that because of the carbon sink values, there are quite a lot of pyrolysis units in the world that start now to produce only biochar, waste every rest of the energy, and this should not be the future for the carbon sink. That's why this is there, but the market already decided in Europe that carbon energy efficiency below 60% is not viable.
Great, thank you, Hans-Peter, and thanks, Harald, and thank you for the comments and the questions. Just moving on, we have about 15 minutes left and some questions in the chat. Thomas, if you want to go ahead, I'll unmute you here.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Hans-Peter, for the great work you have done. As I already had the opportunity to talk to a lot of policymakers also on the EU level, I would like to really underline Peter's point. Even though you say that we give the story, it's easy to communicate and it's easy to understand, I can tell you it's not. It was already very difficult to give them the concept of producing biochar is not consuming energy, it's producing energy, and it's about to use the produced energy and to produce the produced biochar. So we are talking on a totally different level. It's really, we need to be simple and we really need to find a common language. It was also a major hurdle to have biochar carbon removal, to have biocarbons, to have technical carbons, and to have pyrogenic carbon removal, whatever. We had so many different languages. That was a major hurdle. Right now we are on the level of biochar carbon removal, and on the EU level we are talking within the CRCF about permanent carbon removal, about the product category, about carbon farming. So I really like that we don't have, again, different wordings for similar things. Secondly, I would like to ask the C-sink efficiency. I also see a danger here because biochar, one of the most important things about biochar compared to all the other carbon removal technologies is that we have a functional C-sink. So we have a functional carbon sink compared to all the others. But if we are just looking at one parameter, we should have seen, which is also a focus of the CRCF, is that we are looking into different points of sustainability aspects. And I see a danger that if you're just comparing one parameter, who is defining which parameter is the most important one? Because when I just think about using biochar in soils, we increase soil resilience and so on and so on, but it won't be considered. So at the end, maybe C-sink BECCS is better because they are just taking 80% from the CO2 or into geological storage. But in my opinion, the better way is to use biochar because we have more additional value. And the concrete question, it's now funny that I say concrete, is about the material application. When I see that concrete and you say it's there for 100 years, then I don't think I saw that you said there is an opportunity that through thermal heat or thermal treatment that it will be recycled. But if we have a look at concrete, concrete consists of more than 70% of gravel and sand. So is that really a future process that we heat up so much stones to, I don't know, whatever temperature, that this biochar is going to be degraded? Yes, could be technical options, but there are also technical options to just burn soils, but it just does not make sense. And I think we should not have a look at potential things. And yes, there is research and maybe there is something, but I don't think that we should let's say, be too conservative that say there could be this and this option scenario that this and this can happen. Today, what is happening is that concrete is recycled in roads and so ever. So I see for concrete, yes, it needs to be tracked. And yes, this registry is 100% right, but I don't think that it's a good or it's good to say for 100 years, because in 100 years there could be this option for thermal treatment. And as I said, as concrete is consistent or of more than 70% of stones, I don't think that this would be a good idea from an energetic point of view, and I don't think that this is going to be the future. So I think from my perspective, if it is incorporated in such a matrix, we could also go into the permanent category. And now it's not geological, it's for me permanent. Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. I agree with not introducing new terminology when something that works more or less good is already in place. Because we were the first in 2020, there are a lot of things that we just came up with, and in the meantime, there are a lot of other groups and people working on it, and so parallel terminology developed, and I agree that we could go through certain terminologies and update it to align it with whatever the EU, but then there are also the US. They have other terminologies because they work on similar things, but with other administrative guys. Then you have the ISO thing. Funny enough is that BECS, which does not exist yet, claims terminology and tries to not allow it for the use of things that already exist. Similar with DAX. So, I mean, we can always also introduce new terminology that may be more communicative and maybe more prone to success. And I think to use geological storage could help here. But again, I mean, we don't make the laws. We try to be a service provider for the industry, and if terminology should be changed to align it with laws, we do it. You know, from today to after tomorrow. No issue about that. I think then you mentioned the carbon sink efficiency. This is an indicative value, you know, this is not a threshold value. It's not written on the certificate. It is something that we want to control as a monitoring for the entire industry. And we also want the companies to be conscious about the carbon sink efficiency. So, because that's once you can measure it and you have this value, you can also look how to improve it. You know, you do informed decisions. It's only about this. It's nothing more. So I don't think it harms it. All the data are already there, so it takes 5 minutes per year to have this value. But this is a good reflective value of your own operations. And then, yeah, your main questions about the concrete. So there is a method that exists in let's say, technicum state and in science, and this is about the recycling of cement. So you separate the aggregate, and then you have the cement, and you can reactivate the cement with a thermal treatment so that you can reuse the cement as cement, which is different, is not heating up the entire building or the crushed concrete. It is a possibility to not invest all this energy to create new cement, but to recycle cement that was already used, to reactivate it. And also it allows to recycle the aggregate, which is a non-renewable resource. So this is a likely scenario to evolve within the next 100 years. However, it is also likely that in case you would thermally treat in 100 years or in 50 years your cement, that all CO2 emissions that would be caused by the process are captured. So in fact, what we think, and you find this in our articles in the Biochar Journal about the topic, about the carbon cycling economy, we think that no industrial CO2 emissions will occur in the future. And that will also change how we see carbon sink materials, because in fact, once it's in a material and it's assured that it will be in a certain way treated as a waste or recycled, that all emissions of this recycling process will be captured. And that means once it is in a material, it stays a carbon sink. As soon as this is guaranteed, all this can change what we consider now temporary material carbon sinks. If the economy, the policymakers guarantee this, we are on a whole new level of the carbon sink economy, and that's what we aspire to. However, today, this is not the case, and we cannot guarantee geological persistence of materials that can still be burnt. And that's the principle of the standard. Now we hope that this changes. And now there is for concrete materials is a C-Sink 100. That's all that Carbon Future and Puro sells today is C-Sink 100. It's another name because it gives a name to what it actually is and not pretended to be. And here we are again on the communication side. It would be easier to lie a bit about what we do, and then it's easier to convince people. But maybe it also helps to show things as they are. But again, you know, we may find a better way to account for material C-sinks, especially for concrete sinks. And that would be part of the next update. I mean, we are really happy to discuss this with the industry. Now on this system that is established, there's a difference between entry point into geology, because this is not reversible, and everything that's not entered into the geological realm cannot be guaranteed to end there. What if new definitions come up, then we may change this. But this is the underlying logic now. We have to follow this logic, and then we can change it.
Many thanks. Just a very, very brief response about the carbon or C-Sink efficiency. Maybe you consider climate efficiency, because as I said, I think there are several climate positive things like energy productions which should be considered, and overall the climate efficiency is probably the most important thing. Secondly, on the concrete, once more, I think, as you said, in the future it might be changed, but also, as you also said, for BECCS, it just is not here today. Also, what you said, it's in science, it's options, and I don't think that we are here today. And as you said, it will change. And from my perspective, it could be also more likely that we will have more restriction on the carbon content, or on a global or at least European carbon management plan, where we really focus on that carbon which is already preserved somewhere, that it's going to stay there. So I think having now those thoughts, what could happen in the future, is really looking into a glass of I don't know, because we just do not know what's going to happen. Also, if we say that the buildings are going to be there for 80, 100 years, just think back 100 years, it was before the Second World War, so we are totally on a different level. I just want to mention that today's state of the art is that this biochar, which is incorporated in this matrix, it will not enter the atmosphere anymore, 100%. And what is going to happen in 100 years, okay, it can change, but we do not know in which direction. And also, yeah, if you put biochar into soils, you can also burn it if you really want to. If you really want to destroy it, you can burn it. That's what you can do. Really not, it's won't be done, but technically it could be. Many thanks.
Yeah, just one sentence is that if you sell a product and the guarantee of this product for 1,000 years, and you don't know, you have no one who can guarantee it in 50 or 100 years, but you already sell the effect for year 1000, you should be pretty sure. And that's the difference of what we don't know and know, is because you already sell something. And if you don't know, you cannot guarantee what you sell, and that is not a fair business proposition. But beside this, I completely agree. Very, very clear.
Yeah. Thank you, Hans-Peter. I also understand this. Now, a question is just when you start including something in a standard, you're one of different standards. That's one thing. So there are many, or there are several, and there will be more. And it's also that there are political decisions taking place just currently. Also in the framework of the carbon removals of the EU, we're also discussing biochar in materials like concrete or clay. That's another question, by the way, clay, because what do you see there as thermal recycling that can lead to a combustion of the biochar? I didn't get any information on that still. And the other thing is you do inform policies. That's what you know. That's what's good, actually. But that can also have an effect, and rather adverse effect, because if you now include that in a standard or in a methodology, and someone copies that, and we have 100 years in those documents, they're not as flexible as you. You can say, okay, we'll just put out a new version, and that will happen within a few months maybe, and we change this, but this does not mean that it reflects directly on policy. So I would say in some cases, we might be a bit cautious if we don't know before we get something out, because if there's not really a market that needs it larger scale, maybe we should see what political decisions are being taken at national, international levels before we just come out with something, in order not to misinform policies. Do you know what I mean? Like being overly cautious, and they would just take that up, and then we have it for 10 years.
Yeah, and that is the reason, Harald, that we try in this standard to really explain why we come to what conclusion. I think even policymakers, if they take up a concept, and there is a paragraph of 15 lines, I hope they will read the 15 lines about the parameter. So
Yes.
we really take caution, and you know this, and we explained it lengthily. What are the considerations to admit C-Zinc 100 to concrete, even though the average lifetime in the ISO norm for buildings is 60 years. You know, so this is 40 years longer than the life cycle of the building because of those considerations. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right, and that's also a reason why, beside all the ongoing discussions of the standard, it had to be published now because otherwise we still have the old standard out that will be used to copy. And now there are a lot of new elements, and now this is what we try to describe in a consistent, understandable way, and there might be this and that. You're right, Harald. It could become counterproductive, but on the whole, I hope that this standard will be productive also for policymakers to make informed decisions on the new inclusion of biochar into the carbon removal policies.
There I agree. Yeah.
Good. We're a little over time here, but I do want to get to Carla's question. So please, Carla, unmute yourself.
Thanks, Troy. Yeah, hi, my name is Carla. I'm a colleague of Peter, and I will try to keep it quick. I have two remarks. The first one is going pretty much to the first question. I have no doubt that Hans-Peter, you have a very good understanding of the academia behind it and then trying to translate it into something that we can use in the industry. From reading a lot of different methodologies, I can say that if you don't have the background of the full academia behind it, the standard itself sometimes appear a little bit like its own research and academia in itself. So I was wondering if it would be possible to have a tool that even before you get certified, you pretty much can go onto, for example, a CSI website and then get, okay, I'm a very large scale producer. This is probably, then you get some emissions proposed on what's very common for large scale producers to have as production, and you give transport so that you can already kind of see what you're going to end up with in order to give especially maybe medium, small size, but actually also larger ones who maybe have a team of business development who can spend hours on this. The option to see, okay, where do I end up and is my project feasible? Because I have to say, once I actually sign up, for example, EBC or whatever methodology, I'm already that far into the process that I can present them a facility that I already built. So I've already done the investment. I think that would be, at least from a perspective from the industry, useful, and also probably a good test to see if the methodology is that in detail that it's possible to read through it and calculate it yourself, even though I'm not aiming to do that for all the facilities. But yeah, I think that would be one thing. And then the other part, what was a little bit surprising to me was to see that you put a safety margin on the production place, which for me is probably the location in the whole chain that is the most tangible and the most easiest to measure with like different sensors. So maybe you can go into detail why you chose to put a margin. I know from other methodologies that they differentiating between, for example, small and large producers, because they know that some of the technologies that advanced that you can actually quite well measure the exact emissions. So they're kind of benefiting also the ones who are really trying to make it as precise as possible. And that would be also in the end, I think, a good incentive for maybe bigger producers to install a lot of like sensors to make sure that it's actually as precise as possible and make it as efficient and efficiency reduced. And what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's a task for carbon standards to create an environment for the standard that allows the users not to read the standard. Really, this is the task. The standard is still there to look for details as in a dictionary, but it's very sure we want to make it easy for the companies to understand it, to go through, like the example that was asked before, to have these procedures. There's the biochar tool, and I think in future you should not it should not be necessary to read through the entire standards to understand certification and to cooperate with it. But this is the background where we took, you're right, the effort to explain and sometimes a bit scientifically and create the methods. We try to explain to make it, you know, to give reason for someone who wants to go into detail, and carbon standards will create the environment. And maybe Ueli, you want to reply right away?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for the question, Carla. From my side, just Hans-Peter mentioned in the presentation that we have the methane calculator ready. We work on on a kind of planning tool for producers that they can put in their data, their expectations, the quantities that they want to produce, and all the different things. It should not be too complicated, and then it will be, in my understanding, exactly that what you expect. That at the end it's not necessary to go through the standard in all the details. That the software tool will help you and guides you to the right point, and that you are able to take your decisions based on the details that the tool helps you. For that, we have our own software developers. That's something that we had to implement in the last months. It's difficult to develop such tools with external partners. We have our own software developers for that, and it will be a pleasure for us to check also the functionality then with you when we are ready for.
Yeah, sounds good. We're definitely willing to try that.
And for the security margin, it's more to cover scope 3 emissions that are not accounted for. So I think it's pretty clear for the emissions of the company. The scope 1 and scope 2, they are all in. Part of scope 3 is in, but instead of doing a complete LCA, we think it's still fair and correct to account for the remaining emissions with the security margin instead of going to really expensive LCAs. That's the reason for the security margin.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Hans-Peter, as well as Ueli. Really great discussion today, and I was really happy that we could bring you guys in and create a platform to create dialogue in between participants and yourselves. So again, thank you very much, and thanks for everyone for participating today. I know we're a little bit over time, but if anyone from your organizations or your networks have missed this webinar, we will be sharing it, like I mentioned, on our YouTube channel. And always feel free to check out the other webinars that we have published, either on LinkedIn or through our newsletter for EBI members. So again, Hans-Peter, Ueli, thank you very much for your time, and wishing everyone a pleasant rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day too.